Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This module, Reservation for Women and Women's Empowerment, Ground Realities, is the fifth module of the fourth unit, Reservation for Women, Contemporary Debate of the Women's Studies course. The objective of this module is to develop an analytical approach towards the understanding of empowerment and how far it is achievable through the reservations for women. In this module, I begin by discussing the concern for women as it has evolved in the post-independence period through three phases: welfare, development, and empowerment. Along with women's development, the other approach that has come up is women's empowerment. In the next section, I discuss the notion of empowerment itself, how it has been variously defined by various scholars. In the subsequent section, I discuss the relationship between political participation, representation, and empowerment. In the subsequent section, I discuss the experiences derived from reservations for women in panchayats, and finally, I conclude by summarizing the chapter. I begin by discussing the phases through which the concern for women has evolved in the post-independence India. There was an emphasis on welfarism till the fifth five-year plan. The sixth plan marked a shift from welfare to development in the context of policy framework for women. In the seventh plan, the concern with women's development became more pronounced. However, it was the National Perspective Plan for Women which sought to project women as partners in development and not merely as beneficiaries of the development process. Along with women's development, another perspective that has emerged in the contemporary discourse on gender equity is women's empowerment. Following the Beijing conference, the women's empowerment perspective became central to policy discourse. However, the buzz associated with the empowerment of women needs to be examined within the framework of the varied meanings assigned to the term. First, it implies the admission that women have been unempowered. Moving from the paradigm of disadvantage to unempowerment marks a shift from the economic to the political. Further, with increasing talks about women's participation and representation in politics, women's reservation is seen as one of the most effective ways to empower women. The 1996 Beijing Declaration of the United Nations draws a link between political participation and empowerment. Empowerment of women is also one of the Millennium Development Goals. Even the National Policy for the Empowerment of Women 2001 has pronounced this while emphasizing upon the need to ensure women's equality in power sharing and active participation in decision making, including decision making in political process at all levels for achievement of the goals of empowerment. It further says that affirmative action such as reservations or quotas, including in higher legislative bodies, will be considered whenever necessary on a time-bound basis. Let us now come to the discussion on what is empowerment. Before moving towards analyzing whether the reservation for women can be translated into empowerment or not, it would be worthwhile to have a glance on the meaning of the concept of empowerment. Scholars such as Betty and Shireen M. Rai have noted the absence of the term empowerment in glossaries and dictionaries of political theory. However, the term empowerment encompasses and is encompassed in a wide range of social, political, and economic scenarios. That is why numerous interpretations of empowerment abound across interdisciplinary scholarly circles. It has also caught the attention of feminists and is used in several feminist writings. As mentioned earlier, in the sense of being a derivative of power, the term empowerment presupposes the primacy of power over other dimensions. Recent interpretations of empowerment have therefore understandably focused mainly on the power dimension. Griffin defines women's empowerment as, quote, adding to women's power, unquote. Kabir also interprets it as a radical transformation of power relations between men and women. Betty also concedes that empowerment seeks to change society through rearrangement of power. While referring to the notion of power in sociological theory, Betty refers to two conceptions of power, the anarchist and the populist. The former conception talks of a social arrangement where power may be abolished and human life may be reconstituted in a way that the exercise of power becomes redundant. The latter emphasizes on the redistribution of power rather than abolition of it. In this sense, empowerment is concerned with the second view. As Betty points out, in such a redistribution of power, if empowerment implies gain of power by some, it also implies at the same time loss of corresponding amount of power by some others. This may be seen in the context of Weber's definition of power. Quote, "In general, we understand by power the chance of a man or a number of men to realize their own will in a social action, even against the resistance of others who are participating in the action." Unquote. According to Schills, such a conception includes coercion, domination, and manipulation. Beatty calls this approach to power the zero-sum approach, where some have the power to the extent others do not have it. The more power some have, the less others have of it. Kabir also refers to the fact that as long as women's empowerment was argued for as an end in itself, it tended to be heard as a zero-sum game with politically weak winners and powerful losers. Kabir also defines empowerment within the framework of power. She writes, quote, "One way of thinking about power is in terms of the ability to make choices. To be disempowered, therefore, implies to be denied choice. My understanding of the notion of empowerment is that it is inescapably bound up with the condition of disempowerment and refers to the process by which those who have been denied the ability to make choices acquire such an ability." Unquote. She further differentiates between powerful and empowered. In other words, empowerment entails a process of change, she says. People who exercise a great deal of choice in their lives may be very powerful, but they are not empowered in the sense in which I am using the word because they were never disempowered at the first place. Unquote. Parsons is one of those who propose an alternative approach to power, which has been termed as positive sum approach by Beatty, where power may be viewed as a resource of the community as a whole, which it may use more or less effectively in the attainment of its goals. In this conception, there may be an overall increase in the power of a society. With reference to the question of women's empowerment, perhaps it is the second approach which may be found more tenable. Implicit in the conception of empowerment is the assumption that power, which is otherwise believed to have a corrupting influence, may be used as a source of all the good. In that sense, empowerment may have a transformative potential. However, as noted by Rai, feminist preference of the term empowerment over power is because of various reasons. The focus on those who are oppressed rather than the oppressors, its emphasis on power to rather than the assumption of power over, as well as its insistence on power as enabling and competence rather than power as dominance. What explains the growing concerns over underrepresentation of women in political institutions is the expansion of the term empowerment to include institutional strategies for empowerment. Kabir also writes, quote, "The second dimension of power relates to agency, the ability to define one's goals and act upon them. Agency has both positive and negative meanings in relation to power. In the positive sense of the power to, it refers to people's capacity to define their own life's choices and to pursue their own goals, even in the face of opposition from others. Agency can also be exercised in a more negative sense of power over. In other words, the capacity of an actor or category of actors to override the agency of others, for instance, through the use of violence, coercion, and threat. Agency in relation to empowerment, therefore, implies not only actively exercising choice, but also doing this in ways that challenge power relations." Unquote. It is in this sense that empowerment has also been defined as a process that enables women to gain access to and control of material, intellectual, and human resources. Political empowerment of women is part of the overall empowerment process in this context. Political participation is considered to help women gain such access and control. Participation in the decision-making processes leading to increased decision-making power is hoped to lead to women's empowerment. Let us now in this section discuss the relationship between political participation, representation, and women's empowerment. Such an exposition of women's empowerment sets before women the task of increasing their participation by becoming actively involved in the process of decision making. For ensuring participation in political decision making, legislation to this effect has been seen as an imperative by the advocates of women empowerment. Quotas for women have been considered to be one of the most effective tools in this regard. It is also believed that women's increasing representation may lead to better decision making and evolution of gender-sensitive legal framework which may further strengthen women and empower them. However, the belief in the potential of representation to really empower women has been challenged by various scholars. Beatty writes, quote, "So in the end, the Indian way of securing empowerment for the unempowered seems to be by the safe way of providing as extensively as possible quotas on the basis of community, caste, and gender," unquote. He further writes that, quote, "In this way, the burden of empowerment comes to be placed on the system of quotas. It is a very heavy burden for such a system to bear," unquote. He further says that such a system can at best only touch the upper fringes of the redistribution of power in a large and complex society as the Indian society. He believes that the faith that they can by themselves bring about radical or even a perceptible redistribution of power is nothing more than wishful thinking, implying a social cost. Nani Vadekar also points towards the fact that so far the women's movement has not been successful in inducting their spokesperson into the positions of formal power. While she accepts that reservations do ensure effective participation of women, however, absence of overall conducive environment has instead led to trends counterproductive to genuine empowerment of women. Based on the study of implementation of reservation in municipal corporations in Maharashtra, she contends that the counterproductive trends may be contained by introducing effective mechanisms charting a way for reaching the goals of the reservation policy. In the next section, let us discuss some of the experiences of reservation for women in Panchayati Raj. Some scholars, however, cite the success of the 73rd and 74th Amendment Acts in empowering women as the justification for furthering reservations for women in Parliament and state legislatures. It has been said that with the introduction of reservation or quota system in the Panchayati Raj institutions, a great beginning has been made in the direction of legislative empowerment of women, and it is hoped that along with women's empowerment through collective voicing and participation in the development stream, it should go a long way in the real empowerment of women. Matthew writes, quote, "The 73rd and 74th Amendments providing for reservation of not less than 1/3 of the total seats of women in all the 3 tiers of Panchayat system have set in motion a silent revolution in the country towards promoting women's empowerment," unquote. Mohanty also sees it as a silent revolution in the country, however, opines that if reservations have to lead to women's empowerment in real terms, then social, economic and political conditions which facilitate and encourage their participation need to be created, unquote. Reservations at the Panchayat Raj or the village governance level are generally perceived as successful methods to draw out women, particularly the rural population, into the political space. However, as many people pointed out that in such large numbers, there are both successful and unsuccessful stories. In many cases, women are merely puppet representatives of their menfolk and return to their household activities as soon as their terms are over. Thus, the critical question is as to how far reservation for women has been really effective in involving women in the decision-making processes and raising the issues related with women community and getting them integrated with the mainstream of decision-making. Has it really worked in solving the basic issues and problems faced by women in the society? DN writes, quote, "Reservation for women, and that too only in the very minor political bodies, touches merely the surface of the problem of women. But this surface too is determined by the basic structures. An analysis of these basic structures of women's exploitation and oppression is essential for taking a historical stand even on issues that are manifested on the surface." Unquote. While analyzing the role of political participation and representation in empowering women, in one of her papers, Kabir refers to one of the most serious problems in the way of such an empowerment. This is the problem of what she calls the abuse of reservations. She further refers to it while she writes, quote, "There has been much discussion in India about the possibility that women are merely proxies for their husbands or powerful men within their families or caste." Unquote. She further alludes to the allegation that women are made to spend funds not in the interest of other women but as directed by the men. Nevertheless, she also refers to studies from India which showed that many of the elected women in panchayats were gaining confidence, while they also questioned the priorities of panchayat development programs, emphasized local issues affecting women's lives such as fuel and water. Thus, she concludes that reservations for women, granting them participation and representation in political structures, can actually result in the fulfillment of the objective of women's empowerment only if such a participation and representation brings grassroots women to the fore. She writes, "Women's presence in the governance structures of society clearly carries the potential to change unjust practices. But if the women in question are drawn from the narrow elite, if they have been invited rather than elected, and if they have no grassroots constituency to represent and answer to, their presence will only be a token one." It has been said that from early on, debates about participatory politics at the local levels have been important within feminist politics. It has been said that from early on, debates about participatory politics at the local levels have been important within feminist politics. While most of the feminists have supported the cause of reservations for women in the form of quotas, some are opposed to this move on grounds of tokenism. Such a thinking is grounded in apprehension regarding women seeking inclusive spaces within an overwhelmingly male space in the backdrop of the elitist character of parliamentary democracy in India. Kishwar is opposed to the idea of reserving constituencies for women, as she believes forcing women to contest against women only will ghettoize women. This contention is consistent with the idea of empowerment based on the zero-sum approach. In the case of reserved constituencies for women, some women might gain power at the expense of not the men but other women. Such a system may not result in real empowerment of women. Rai also writes that the concerns about co-optation and elitism remain real for many feminist and women's groups in India. While she cites Menon, the link between reservations in parliament and empowerment of women is at best tenuous and may even be a way of closing off possibilities of further radicalization of Indian politics. If we attempt to recover feminist politics as subversion, we would need to move away from politics as merely seeking space within already defined boundaries of power." Unquote. Some others find the reservations as an inadequate method for challenging the gender hierarchy and thus empowering women. Hoskins and Rai say that the selective inclusion of women in the political process is important but inadequate in challenging the established hierarchy of power relations. Thus, the issue of whether or not reservations pave the way for empowerment of women is a debated one. Nevertheless, it may be argued that at least some connections may be drawn between representation, participation, reservation, and empowerment. To summarize, in this module, we have discussed how the concern for women in post-independence India has evolved through three phases: welfare, development, and empowerment. We have also seen that along with the approach to women's development, the another approach that came to the forefront, particularly after the Beijing Declaration, has been the approach of women's empowerment. Since women's empowerment assumes that women had been earlier unempowered, this ensures the centrality of power over other concerns regarding women. Such an empowerment is believed also to be made possible through political representation of women. Political participation, it is said, empowerment has been seen as a process of gaining women access to and control over natural, intellectual, and human resources. Political participation is seen as a key to such empowerment. However, scholars have been divided in their opinions regarding whether empowerment is possible through reservations for women in India. Thanks.